Well, in my videos to my latest videos, which all were directed at YouTube user Seeley47, who's a British socialist, YouTuber. So I couldn't help but notice that that mine having made responses to him bumped up his viewership quite a bit, although it's mostly negative press because they're my subscribers or people who are subscribed to me. I don't own them. Um, And at one point, not to me, actually to somebody else, he made a comment basically saying, well, we are the state. In a socialist country, or maybe he said democratic, but in the type of society that we have, referencing the UK, uh, there is not a distinction between government and society, and so to be anti-government is to be anti-society, and to accuse the government of doing X, Y, and Z, it's just like saying society is doing X, Y, and Z. And I think that there is some basis for that terminology. I don't think that it's correct to say that the populace at large and the government are completely, totally distinct with zero connection between the two. I think that's not true. I don't think there are many libertarians who explicitly say that, although I think it's fairly common for them in just routine parlance to speak in a way that might suggest that. Now, I don't think that's true, but what I also think is not true is the idea to think that there aren't gradations of influence on the government and that there are thresholds that indicate relationships with the state that are just different in magnitude and in kind. So the average person, and in the United, and we're going to talk about, this video is going to address voting, and just to compare the US and the UK, there's the obvious demographic fact that the United States is far larger. I think the population of the United States is over 300 million now, something in maybe the 310, maybe even 320. UK, I haven't checked in a while, but isn't it somewhere between 70 and 80? So that would be at least maybe 4.5 times fewer people. And so if we were just to ignore the fact that most of the populace isn't actually in the electorate because they're too young or too old or not registered or whatever, we just use those numbers. You could, I guess, say, well, the average person in the UK has a 1/70 millionth say, and the average person in the US only has a 1/300 millionth say, which is not exactly accurate because we have an electoral college in the United States, and so actually people who are in lower population states like Wyoming and Vermont are more likely to have an effect on a presidential election than a person who lives in California or New York. And then there's a whole swing states, and there's the fact that we have representative democracy in both countries and not direct democracy. But needless to say, as on a national stage, which is not the same as what it would be locally, depending on how local you go, either case, your influence as a voter is measured in the millionths, the one divided by tens of millions, or in the United States, potentially hundreds of millions. So that's a pretty light influence. Now, people influence the state in ways in addition to their electoral clout. It's pretty hard to quantify, and not as hard, but still difficult to qualify. You can always just directly beseech government officials, either within the bureaucracy or within the political class. Remember, most of the government are not elected officials. Most of them are a bureaucracy, and they have their own incentives and their own their own agenda, and that is not wholly 100% divorced from what the greater society wants. So most bureaucrats realize that, for instance, the FBI realizes that they just can't go around murdering thousands of people every day. They do murder people. They murder Americans on, a somewhat regular basis, but the number isn't very high. And I think they realize that if they were to just go around murdering way more, that would look really bad and give them a really bad rap. Or if they they realize that if their agents get caught, having sex with prostitutes or doing drugs, that would look really bad. And so they have an incentive to try and curtail that. Now, that's an influence that you're not going to see electorally because no one in the FBI gets elected. And even the politicians who are nominally in charge of the FBI, they are limited practically and legally in what they can actually do. Just as a matter of case, they can't be paying particular close attention to every bureaucrat. Maybe they can point out the heads, but one bad FBI agent or one bad DMV agent or one bad ATF agent is not going to be something that the president or Congress can really look at. And but that's not to say there's no influence at all, because there is some, but I think if you add it all up, it's somewhere between infinitesimal and negligible. And there are ways you can increase it. Like Rush Limbaugh has more influence on the government than your average American, and that is because he has a large audience. And how many of them are going to literally vote based on what he says or agitate based on what he says? Who knows? It probably depends on what he's trying to get agitated and whatnot, but it could be in the millions. And so obviously his opinion is going to have more influence on the state than just someone like me who has a couple hundred YouTube subscribers, most of whom probably don't vote, a lot of whom are not even in the United States, and so the electoral politics of the United States wouldn't matter at all. Really powerful televangelists can be this way. Certain intellectuals like perhaps Noam Chomsky, although he doesn't seem to have a lot of influence because he's been berating Barack Obama for a long time, and his main influence is on the left, and the left doesn't seem to care at all about that because they have priorities that are greater than pure intellect, to the extent that that can even be attributed to Chomsky, which is debatable in and of itself. But he has more influence than just your regular person. But by and large, your average person has very, very, very little influence. The effect of voting is negatory. And I think there's a threshold here, and the threshold, I think, is what can you do with government property? If we really, like his statement, Saley 47, if it's literally true that we are the state, then you or I or any other person would be able to exercise control over government property, because if we are the government, then government property is our property. And if something is your property, then you can use it. If it's literally your property, then you can use it unconditionally. Now, it's possible to have co-owned things. So, say me and my spouse could both be the half owner of our home. I don't actually have a spouse, but let's just say, half owners of our homes. Then I couldn't, if I own my own home all the way, I could just burn it down to the ground. If I own my own in half with somebody else, or maybe they only own 40% and I own 60%, then I can't just do whatever I want. I have to have some kind of accommodation to them. If I were to just burn down the whole thing, then they could say, you burn down, the 50% or the 40% share, and so you owe me damages, or, unless you had my permission to do it. But if we keep dividing it, there comes a point where our ownership of said property over said institution becomes negligent. And I think a good analogy here, since for all the socialists out there, is stock ownership in large corporations. You can buy stock in the largest, most evil corporation you can imagine, say Walmart or ExxonMobil or whatever, and your share literally is entitled to a part ownership. And you might, and I think most socialists would agree, well, it's kind of a sham then to say that you own, like that you and the CEO of Walmart are on equal terms. And the CEO of Walmart owns so many shares. They have executive power. You don't. You can't just take your shares in Walmart. You can't, I used to own stock in Pepsi and in Tricon, which is their restaurant branch. They eventually broke up. And Tricon owns a huge number of restaurants. They own KFC, Pizza Hut, Taco Bell, and even some other ones. Now, I could not just walk into a Taco Bell and say, I'm a part owner, So I'd like, you know, a number 3 and a number 4 and a large Sprite and make it snappy. My share didn't entitle me to that. I couldn't alienate any of the property. The only thing I could do is buy and sell that share. And there were certain times when voting was allowed. You know, should this or that happen? I think my shares were so small, it really didn't make sense for me to put much time and effort into trying to discern what exactly I would be voting on. Uh, you know, my impression was that the only things they really allowed to be voted on by the general stockholders were things that they really didn't care that much about. The big decisions were being made in, you know, the quintessential smoky office room. But I could alienate that. So if I didn't like the way Pepsi was running, I didn't have to own their stock. I could sell it and make money off of it. And of course, I wasn't obligated to be an owner in Pepsi. So there was nothing that Pepsi could do to force me to subsidize them. I could just say, I don't like Pepsi. I'm not going to buy anymore. They could never see another dime of my money. As little control as I had over PepsiCo or Tricon or any other of the stocks I owned, which was not many. I was never a stockbroker. It's just I had relatives who were stockbrokers who would give me stock for like birthdays and Christmas and stuff. Just little amounts, not like, oh, here's 1,000,000 shares. Richie rich, no. I had more control over that than you ever have over the government. Just think about it like this. If we are the government, then you should be able to walk up to a police car, a cop car, and just say, hey, I'm taking this for a spin. I need to drive around for a while. You won't be allowed to do that. You can't just go into a government building and just say, I need this office space, I need this. They aren't there for you. If you have some, if you want to pretend that your vote is making you part of the state, then the amount of control you exercise over it is, like I said, it's not infinitesimal, because that would mean like 0, but it approaches there, and it's less than negatory. You have 0 property rights when it comes to government property, and so to say that you are an owner of it, or that it is you, there's a distinction between you and the police. The police officer can get in his car and drive around. Now, he's supposed to do his job, but if he wants to take little extra side trips to, you know, maybe go get donuts or go to a drive-through. I mean, when I worked at fast food, we had cops coming through the drive-through all the time in their uniforms, in their cars. Just a little thing. You know, they operate. They have a lot more, a much higher ownership share in that vehicle than does any just non-police agent. In fact, the aggregation of all non-police agents together. So you could have that one police officer and then everyone else in society who votes, and that one police officer has more say than all of them put together. And you can say, well, we can vote them out of office, but look, the government controls the voting process. They decide what's on the ballot, who gets to vote, what the electorates are, which is a huge deciding what the electorates are de facto means you are deciding what's getting passed and what's not getting passed. Let's just have a hypothetical society. Say there's 1,000 people. We say, well, we got to have a government, and we don't want to have a monarch, so let's have a democratic. Let's have democracy, and then we realize, well, let's have representative democracy, and so we have to say, okay, well, who's voting for what? You know, we can't all vote for every single representative, and so we're going to have to decide what the electorates are going to be and say, okay, well, either all the people this age are going to vote for somebody, or all the people with this or that characteristic, or all the people who live in this area, which is how it usually is based on geography. Okay, everyone in this area. And since we're trying to decide how we're going to do things democratically, there's only really there's one democratic way we could decide this, and this is if there was unanimity. If every single person in our 1,000-person society agreed, like, okay, we should have 10 representatives and they should be representatives, if every single person agreed, then we would have we'd have not just consensus, we'd have unanimity. And you could call that democratic, although it'd almost be silly because we're all agreeing there's nothing to even debate. Oh my gosh, a cop car just drove by. That's really odd. I almost, my entire life, I've maybe only seen two or three in my neighborhood. Anyway, um, if we can't do it that way, if some people, if there's disagreement about where the electorate should or should not go, then we can't really decide it democratically because that's what's under discussion. You know, if me and my 20 friends say, well, we want this electorate, and so we vote, and oh, it's 20-0, we get it. And you say, no, no, me and my 15 friends, we don't think that you're even in our electorate. We think we're our own electorate, or we think maybe there's a little overlap between these two or three individuals, and there is no democratic resolution to this. All right, someone's just going to have to decide, which is what happens. I mean, if you look at Parliament, for instance, in the UK, its earliest iterations were appointments by the king. Now, eventually, those appointments became more powerful relative to the king. Again, we debate how much, but and they started appointing, gerrymandering the system to their own wishes, but it wasn't democratic. It wasn't like everyone in society got together and decided unanimously what the various seats of parliament are going to be, or the various electoral districts in the United States. It's a very, very political thing, and we know for a fact that they gerrymander, that they adjust the boundaries in order to maximize their own political power. Usually along party lines, sometimes along personal lines. There are cases of gerrymandering to make one person basically invincible electorally. And I've heard in the UK it's something like 80+% of the districts are safe for one party. So either Labour or the Conservatives or the Tories or whoever else you have, or maybe even the Green Party in some cases, they're going to win in most of the districts. There's no question who's going to win. It's only about 20% where there's even a chance. In the United States, it's similar. I don't think the exact proportions are the same, but that's not an accident. They gerrymander it to win. And so uh, with that amount of control, then the say of individual voters is that much more diminished, because you don't even get to say where you want to vote, other than completely moving, and they could always just change the boundaries anyway. And so and then of course they count the votes, which makes all the problems for voter fraud. How much voter fraud there is, it's not clear. I think we have actual proven examples, and we just have to assume that those are the minimum, because we can't. I think it's unlikely that we catch all instances of it. Now, how much more prevalent is it? It varies. My basic impression is that in certain areas it's absolutely rampant, and in other areas it's less rampant. And I think that's a reflection of how much is at stake. So in Chicago or New York City, where being in political control means literally the difference between millions or billions of dollars and enormous political power, that there's a lot more than in a district where it's basically rural. There isn't a lot of wealth, and the winner or the loser is not going to be nearly so powerful. So there's less incentive for there to be fraud, but there still could be, because you always have egotistical people who want to be in power. Now, you might say, yeah, representative democracy, but I believe in direct democracy. The same problem still applies. If you want to have direct democracy, unless you want every single person to be voting on every single issue, which is prohibitive. I mean, if you're a standard socialist, then your idea of what the scope that government should be dealing with is pretty expansive. Regulations on every type of industry, taxes, whatever. Basically every aspect of life to some degree requires voting then. And so we wouldn't just be voting on person X or person Y. We'd be voting on how like what the chemical content of nylon should be, how many seeds can be in watermelons, how much nitrogen can be put in chip bags, how much lumber can be felled in this forest and how much can be felled in that forest, how long launch. I mean, we would be voting. The number of things that we'd have to like vote on would be literally millions or billions of things, and we just couldn't do it. And there's the open question of how relevant is it to have everybody vote on everything when not everything affects everybody equally. So if we're going to be voting on, say, building a bridge from island A to town B, do people in island A and town B have the same vote as other people who live, say, 1,000 miles away, or in the case of the UK, 100 miles away? Should their votes count equally? It's hard to see exactly why. Or the people who are going to build the bridge, they have the same vote as the people who are just going to use the bridge, or the people who are never even going to see the bridge, or the people who don't care, or the people who are ignorant. You know, I don't care how smart you are, you don't know enough about everything that you want to regulate. I don't. Nobody does. I mean, maybe you think the government should be regulating everything, but do you know, how much pollution is too much pollution? How many parts per million of chemical Y mixed with substance uh, Z are okay? And, how much labor units should be? Do you know all that? No. Maybe there's a couple areas where you're pretty well informed. Maybe there's a lot of areas where you're really well informed. So how are we going to decide who votes where? What? The whole direct democracy raises a whole host of other issues that really can't be resolved democratically either. Because if we're going to say vote on the bridge from town island X to town Y, and you say, well, we should all have an equal vote, and I say, well, I'm from town X, and so I think my vote should count 50% more than yours, then we can't resolve this dispute. Absent unanimity, we can't resolve it through an election. I mean, if we both agree, if you say 10% and I say 20%, then all right, problem solved. But if we don't agree, then we can't resolve it electorally, because you're going to say, well, I vote, that's 1, and you vote, that's 2, and I say, no, you vote 1, and I vote, and that's 1.5. So, all right, capitalism is about to deliver me food. 1 second. I'm not going to complain about that. But just as an example there, I just ordered a pizza. I made a decision. I made a value judgment that the money I spent is worth the pizza I'm getting. But if we were going to put that into democratic, is it healthy? Is it not healthy? Is the pleasure I get from eating it worth the corrosion to my arteries and the gas mileage of the guy? Is that worth how much he's getting paid? And we could break it down to the number of transactions, the market transactions that take place in that, considering the production chain to produce the pizza and to get the guy here and to get my phone to work and all that. We're talking like literally tens of thousands, maybe even millions of potentially votable actions. And who's to? It's just there's a whole slew of problems. And the other thing is the whole premise, the whole justification for voting. There's a couple. The consequentialist ones are kind of silly. There's no evidence that getting a majority of people to vote for something is somehow objectively a better decision, because the majority of people can be wrong, especially when they have no incentive to find the information to be right. There's rational ignorance. People say it's never rational to be ignorant. I say, really? So, I mean, I've had people tell me it's never rational to be ignorant. No, it is. I mean, do you know about the mating habits of some obscure lemur species in Madagascar? Probably not. And should you be chided for not knowing that? No. No, unless that was something you needed to know for your living or you were just really interested in. All right, so do I know about the infrastructure on Island X and Place Y if I've never been there, if I've never going there? No. And should I be chided for that? No. And yet, there's this, and not every Democrat feels this way, but part of the justification is, oh well, if everyone votes, somehow the average wisdom of society is going to come through, and that's just not true. The other thing is kind of a priori. If a majority votes for something, then by definition it's true, and that's just, I think most people are not comfortable with that because they realize, okay, well that could hypothetically justify even the most terrible things that have ever existed. Slavery, war. I mean, majorities of populations have been willing to go to war for stupid reasons all through history. So there's that. But then the other thing is, well, it's just, even if it's not the best decisions, even if they're not always the right decisions, it's just the most fair because then every single person gets one vote, gets the same say. And two problems with that is, one, it's an open question whether everyone should have the same say. Like, shouldn't I have more say about whether I eat a pizza than everyone else? Or people who are disinterested or completely ignorant. And the other thing is, it's not true, because as soon as you start having people that have influence over the voting of others, then the whole one person, one vote thing goes out the window. If there are people who are able to influence others to how they vote, then they have clearly more electoral power and decision-making power than people who exercise less influence over people or no influence over people. And so it's the reduction of social decision-making to voting does not lead to egalitarianism. It never has historically. It doesn't. I mean, you have socialist countries in Europe, but they don't have less stratification of wealth than they did previously. You don't have any upward mobility. I mean, you have a political class that's just vastly more powerful than the average person. And so, and I didn't, this whole talk about voting is a little tangential, but basically the amount of influence that any average person has over the state is extremely limited. And there are other people in society, mostly within the government, but also powerful lobbyists or whatnot, who have inordinately more influence over the state. And to just, if you want to say there's a gradation, and sure, I only have a 0.001 and they have 100 times more, then you can stand on technical correctness and say you still have an influence even if it's only 0.00001. But what I'm saying is that may be, but there's an order of magnitude difference, that some people have vastly more powerful influence over the state than do you or the average voter or anybody whose only influence extends to electoral politics, and that we should operate on that understanding. And there is no way to make it so that everyone has an equal influence on the state. It's impossible, because you're always going to have voting blocks, you're always going to have political leaders, you're always going to have people who are more persuasive or who are more knowledgeable or who are just better placed just by sheer chance and circumstance to be able to influence the state. And so to pretend like state actions are our actions when there are just a relatively small group, maybe it's 1,000 people, maybe it's 10,000 people, who have essentially monopolistic control over political decision making, which I think is fair. And then you have 300 million or 299,990,000 other people whose aggregate control over the state is less than that other group. And again, how big is that other group? Whatever, we can debate, but then that should be the basis. That's the realistic basis of our influence on the state. Not, oh, we all have equal say, or it's us. It is an oligopoly, and this again is very odd to me that someone lives in a monarchy, as if you and the Queen of England are of equal standing vis-a-vis the government. No, like no. even in the explicit constitution of your country, that's not the case. So we are not the state. If we were, we could just we would have every right to, you know, use government property any way we see fit. Oh, I like this national park. I think I'm going to just camp here. You can't even do that without their say-so. So they're exercising control. They're exercising ownership. Their control and ownership is viewed as legitimate, whereas yours and mine are not. So, I mean, our control over it is, like I said, but somewhere between infinitesimal and negligible. And someone like Barack Obama's control over it is not that. It's greater. Not total either. Nobody has total control over the state. There are lots of people who have wanted that and have aspired to get that, and some who have gotten relatively close. But it's never happened, and it's probably not literally possible. But that doesn't mean that we all live in an egalitarian wonderland where everyone has an equal voice. Not even close. And it's just delusional to believe that. So, you know, if your socialist worldview is based on the assumption that we all have an equal voice in the state, or even that we could, then that's delusional. You need to have a better argument for why socialism than that, because that doesn't exist now. It's never existed in the past. And there are good theoretical reasons to assume, apart from empiricism of all history, that that can never really happen. So, all right, I am going to consume my the fruit of my capitalist labor, and that's it.